The wind screamed against the cabin walls, a sound Jonah Brooks had come to know well in the Montana winters. But tonight, it wasn't just the wind. The storm howled with a deeper, almost human grief, rattling the shutters like the staccato burst of distant gunfire. Snow surged in white sheets past the frosted windows, and every few seconds the old pine outside groaned under the weight of ice. Jonah sat at the kitchen table, the glow of a single lantern spilling over maps and a half-empty mug of coffee gone cold. He'd been a soldier long enough to recognize when nature meant business, and this storm had the same presence as a battlefield, unpredictable, merciless, and waiting for a mistake. Then he heard it. Not the moan of the wind, not the crack of ice-laden branches, something softer, almost swallowed by the storm. A faint whimper, high and thin, carried between gusts. Jonah's back went rigid. Instinct sharpened his senses the way it always had when something in the distance didn't belong. He pushed back his chair and grabbed his heavy coat from the peg. Boots slid over thick socks, gloves over hands that still remembered the precise tension of a trigger. He reached for his flashlight, its beam slicing into the whirling darkness as he stepped outside. The cold hit him like a shove. Wind clawed at his face, and snow stung his eyes until tears blurred his vision. He moved forward, scanning the tree line, pausing between gusts to listen. The whimper came again, closer now, though nearly lost in the roar of the blizzard. He crested a small rise, his breath fogging in the beam of his light, and froze. Two shapes materialized through the swirling flakes. A chestnut-brown mare, her muscles taut under a coat glazed with frost, standing over a smaller figure pressed to her flank. The yearling's narrow blaze was barely visible beneath snow caked to his face, his front right leg trembling under weight it couldn't bear. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. The mare's dark eyes held the wild, fear, exhaustion, but also a fierce shield between Jonah and the fragile creature she guarded. Her body angled to block him, her hooves sunk deep in the drift. Jonah felt the weight of the moment, a silent standoff in the heart of the storm. Everything he knew about the wild told him to back off. Mustangs didn't need humans. They survived because they didn't trust them. And yet, the yearling shifted, the leg buckling, his body sagging against his mother. The sound he made, not a scream, not even a cry, just a desperate little exhale, sliced through Jonah like shrapnel. Memories slammed into him unbidden. Men down in the dust, the copper smell of blood under a searing sun, the helplessness that came when you couldn't get there fast enough. He'd sworn never to feel that again, never to stand by when there was still a chance to act. Snow swirled between them, erasing footprints almost as soon as they formed. The mare's ears flicked back against the wind, then forward again, her gaze locked on him as though weighing her own gamble. Jonah's heart thudded against his ribs. He could walk away, let the wild take its course, let nature decide. That was the safe choice, but safe had never been what kept people alive. He took a slow step forward, lowering his flashlight beam so it wouldn't blind them. The mare didn't move, but her head dipped slightly, nostrils flaring in the cold air. Jonah spoke, low, steady, the way he used to talk to panicked men under fire. His voice was almost lost to the storm, but it was enough to carry an intent. "I'm not here to hurt you." The wind gusted hard, nearly knocking him sideways, and he made his choice. In 3 long strides, he was at the paddock gate, fumbling it open with numb fingers. He stepped back, leaving the entrance wide, and let the storm push his scent toward them. The mare's muscles quivered. The yearling limped forward half a step, then faltered. The mare glanced back at him, then at Jonah, as though weighing two dangers. Jonah waited. He'd learned in the worst places on earth that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was stand still. Then, slowly, the mare moved. One cautious hoof, then another, guiding her injured foal toward the open gate and into the uncertain shelter of the light spilling from Jonah's cabin. The storm had swallowed the world in white by the time Jonah swung the paddock gate shut. He could barely see his own boots in the snow, but the dark shapes of the mare and yearling stood clear against the drifted ground, steam rising from their bodies in slow, ghost-like tendrils. Inside the paddock, the mare pivoted, planting herself between Jonah and the smaller horse. Her head was high now, ears stiff, the whites of her eyes flashing under the light from the cabin window. Every line of her body warned him, "Don't come closer." Jonah knew the rule of the wild. You don't interfere with Mustangs. Nature doesn't take kindly to human hands trying to rewrite its decisions. But as he studied the yearling, the logic began to splinter. The colt's front right leg trembled, the fetlock joint swollen under a crust of snow. He shifted his weight, tried to stand square, and failed. Jonah felt the old reflex kicking in, the one that had nothing to do with horses and everything to do with bleeding men on the edge of life and death. He could still see the desert sand turning black under a buddy's shoulder, still hear the rush of breath when a tourniquet tightened just in time. Those memories didn't belong here in the snow, but they came anyway. The wind ripped across the paddock, driving flakes into his eyes. He pulled off one glove with his teeth and raised his bare hand, palm out, fingers loose. He spoke again, steady and low. The mare's ears twitched toward him, but her body didn't ease. "You're not going to make it out here, girl," he murmured, more to himself than her. Step by step, he moved toward the corner of the paddock, where an old stack of hay leaned against the rail. The scent drifted across, and the mare's nostrils flared. She didn't move, but the colt lifted his head, curious despite himself. That was the opening Jonah needed. He eased the hay to the ground, keeping his movements slow. Then he knelt, pulling an old army blanket from the storage bin by the fence. The blanket smelled faintly of diesel and campfire, remnants of another life. But it was thick, dry, and warm. The mare's tail flicked in quick warning when he shifted closer. Jonah paused, let the wind carry his scent toward her. "Easy now," he said, voice almost swallowed by the storm. The colt tried to step forward again and stumbled hard, catching himself just short of going down. That decided it for Jonah. He rose, closing the gap in 2 long strides, not giving himself the chance to second guess. The mare's muscles bunched, but Jonah didn't reach for her. Instead, he crouched beside the colt, his hands moving with the precision of years spent under pressure. He ran his fingers gently along the leg, feeling for heat and swelling. The colt shivered but didn't pull away. Jonah wrapped the limb in the blanket, securing it with strips of torn rope he'd stuffed in his pocket. Each knot was firm but careful, his gloved fingers steady despite the biting cold. The mare's breath puffed hot against his cheek once, close enough to feel. He kept his eyes down, not challenging her gaze, but he could sense her watching every move. When the leg was supported, Jonah shifted back, giving them space. The colt leaned into the warmth of the blanket, his breathing easing. The mare's ears tilted forward now, no longer pinned flat. Jonah stepped to the fence and grabbed a bucket, breaking the ice crust over the water trough before filling it. He placed it within reach and set the hay beside it. He straightened, his back aching from the cold, and met the mare's eyes at last. Something had shifted there. Still wild, still wary, but no longer closed entirely. Lightning-fast memories flickered in his mind, standing in a dusty alley with a wounded man at his feet, hearing the whine of incoming rounds, feeling that split-second relief when the evac bird appeared overhead. Tonight's battle was quieter, the enemy not another man, but the storm itself. He wasn't sure why it felt the same in his chest. By the time he made it back to the cabin, snow had piled high on his shoulders. He paused in the doorway, glancing back at the paddock. The mare stood guard, her head lowered toward the colt, whose legs were folded neatly beneath him on the hay. Jonah shut the door against the cold. But the sound of the storm had changed somehow. The wind still battered the walls, yet there was a thread of something else beneath it, a hum in his chest he hadn't felt in years. Not victory, not safety, but the first edge of connection. Morning came like a shy visitor, pressing a pale band of light against the frosted window panes before slipping over the paddock. The storm had emptied itself in the night. Now the world was muffled and new, every fence post capped with sugar white, every pine limb sagging under a clean, glittering weight. Jonah Brooks stepped onto the porch with a thermos of coffee and a bucket of warm water that steamed in the cold. The air at 6,000 feet bit cleanly through his lungs. Pine, snow, a faint trace of wood smoke lifting from the chimney. Sierra was already watching. The chestnut mare stood square in the drifted paddock, snow crusts salted along her mane, ears pricked toward him. She moved a half step to the side so Jonah could see the yearling tucked behind her shoulder. Ash blinked in the morning glare, his narrow white blaze bright against his lighter coat. The blanket around his front leg was still snug where Jonah had tied it, a small knot resting at the back of the fetlock like a promise. Jonah stopped just inside the gate and let the silence breathe. It was a kind of truce he'd learned in other landscapes, deserts, alleys, rooftops, and it worked here in the mountains too. Don't rush. Let the bare fact of you settle in the space. Let them see you mean no harm. Morning, he said, voice low. Sierra's ears twitched toward him. She didn't soften, not yet, but the whites of her eyes weren't showing. Jonah set the bucket down slowly, metal feet squeaking on hardpack. The steam ribboned up and drifted in the light wind. Ash reached first, a tiny lean forward, nostrils flaring, curiosity nudging past caution. Sierra breathed out, a soft huff that fogged the air, and Jonah felt something loosen in his chest. He broke the ice crust on the trough again and laid fresh hay along the rail. The movements were deliberate, quiet. No sudden angles, no hard squares in his body. He talked a little while he worked. Not words that mattered, just a slow bar of sound with the shape of reassurance. You're good. Steady now. Plenty of hay. Ash nickered, a small, surprised sound at the warmth of the water. Sierra kept one eye on Jonah as the colt drank, then dipped her own muzzle. Her jaw moved with a patient rhythm, the tendons along her cheek working like braided rope. Jonah watched the way the light struck the black of her forelock and the deep red undercoat, the way strength and wariness lived comfortably in the same body. He eased closer by inches, stopping whenever Sierra's head rose a little too fast. When he was near enough to touch, he didn't. He crouched instead, putting his shoulder lower than hers, and waited for the space between them to say the next thing. The cold crept through his jeans and up his knees, but he stayed there until Sierra blinked. A small, unremarkable blink, like closing a door without slamming it. All right, he whispered. He reached toward Ash's wrapped leg. Sierra stepped to block, an automatic slide of muscle and intent. Jonah stopped his hand and let it hover, fingers open. Easy, he breathed. Sierra's ears flicked. She didn't move away, but she didn't press closer either. Jonah adjusted the blanket with 2 slow motions, tightening the rear tie, checking for heat along the tendon. The swelling had gone down a shade, not much, but not nothing. He felt the colt's tremor through the weave of the blanket. The fragile electricity of an animal learning where pain ends and relief begins. When Jonah stood, feeling the blood prick back into his legs, the world tilted for a heartbeat with a memory he hadn't invited. A tent at dawn, canvas breathing in and out, a friend awake before reveille, lacing boots with hands that shook just enough to show. A quiet voice across the space. "You good?" "Yeah." Comma for calm, dash for tension. The sounds of it still lived in his bones. He let the memory pass through without clinging to it, like watching a hawk cross an open sky. Then he shook flakes from his shoulders and went to fetch more hay. Inside the cabin, the silence felt different. Not the old emptiness that scratched at the back of his skull, but a kind of listening. Hoofbeats thudded softly against packed snow outside. When he stirred the pot on the stove, the spoon tapped the rim with a domestic certainty he hadn't felt in years. He poured oatmeal into a bowl, sat at the small table, and left the door cracked so the cold could carry the horse's breath into the room. He told himself he was watching for trouble, for signs the blanket had slipped or the fence had drifted too deep. But the truth laid itself down simply. He wanted them there. The cadence of their presence steadied his hands. Later, when the sun nudged over the ridge and scattered diamonds across the field, he brought out a stiff bristled brush. He didn't aim it at Sierra. He set it on the fence and let it be an idea in the air. Ash nosed the wood first, then jerked back like he'd touched a spark. Jonah chuckled under his breath. "Curious, huh?" he said. Ash edged forward again, muzzle grazing the handle. Sierra's head came up. Jonah paused. The mare studied the brush, as if it might turn into something else without warning. Finally, she shifted one hoof, a quiet move that read less like permission and more like, "I'll allow this much." Jonah picked up the brush, held it out, and waited. Ash sniffed the bristles. Jonah drew one line along the colt's shoulder, light as breath, careful not to snag. Ash flinched, then stilled, eyes going soft at the sensation of pressure and heat moving dirt beneath winter coat. Jonah kept it brief. 1 pass, 2, 3, then he set the brush down again. "Leave the door open. Don't push them through it." By midday, clouds thinned to a pale milk glass, and the mountains stepped forward, black spruce ridges, blue shadows stacked like folded blankets. Jonah checked the wraps again and found the smallest marker of progress. When he touched the bandage, Ash didn't lean away. He only shifted weight and cocked an ear toward Sierra, as if asking a question he already knew the answer to. "Good," Jonah said softly. "That's good." He walked the perimeter of the paddock, testing weak spots where drifts had piled over the lower rails. Tracks stitched the fresh snow. Rabbit, fox, a single wing print where an owl had taken something in the night. He saw his own boot marks from the storm, truncated lines that ended at the gate and began again at the porch. And he felt the newness of another pattern layered beside them. Hoof circles by the water, a small trench where Ash had rested, the tidy scuff of Sierra's pawing when the hay came late. Inside, he scribbled a note in the spiral pad he kept by the radio. 0900, swelling reduced, appetite strong, Sierra guarding but yielding space in increments. Ash tolerates contact 3-5 seconds. The clinical tone steadied him. He knew how to make a plan if he had data. Afternoon slid in quiet. He cut wood, mended a torn strap on the blanket, and let the rhythm of simple work tidy the rooms inside his head. Twice Sierra startled at the slap of an axe into the block, but twice she settled when Jonah lowered the tool and spoke in that same calm ribbon of sound. Just wood. Easy now. As the light thinned, Jonah stood at the fence and listened to the mountain hush, the kind that collects at day's edge when the sun slides behind a ridge and every tree exhales. Ash laid down carefully, folding his legs with that coltish awkwardness that still found grace at the end. Sierra remained standing, but her eyelids drooped, her breath long and even. Jonah rested his forearms on the top rail. For the first time in years, he felt the edges of his world soften, not widen, not yet, but ease. The cabin no longer felt like a bunker. It felt like a place where a man could put down what he was carrying, if only for the length of a winter afternoon. He almost didn't notice the sound at first. A distant rumple, like snow sloughing from a far-off slope. Then another, sharper, a hollow thock atop the cold's hush, too regular to be falling ice. He straightened and scanned the tree line, his senses drawing together in that old, efficient way. Nothing moved among the pines. The sky had gone lavender at the edges. He stood there until the cold bit through his coat, until the horse's quiet drew him back to the present. Maybe it was nothing, a branch settling, a fox testing crusted snow. Still, he took one more look at the ridge before heading inside. The evening would bring new frost, and with it, another round of tending the bandage and laying hay. Trust was forming here, thin as a thread, but strong enough to hold if no one pulled too hard. He closed the cabin door gently and set his hat on the peg. Outside, the mountains held their breath. Somewhere in the distance, a sound he couldn't name faded into the snow, leaving only the soft, steady cadence of hooves and winter air, and the uneasy suggestion that the world beyond the fence had taken notice. The days had fallen into a rhythm that Jonah didn't want to name, for fear of jinxing it. Morning coffee, paddock check, fresh hay, and a slow inspection of Ash's leg. Sierra no longer stood rigid when he entered. She still kept herself between Jonah and her yearling, but the air between them didn't bristle the way it had. The blanket stayed in place now without rope ties, a sign she was beginning to trust his intentions. The weather had shifted too. The storms had spent their fury for the moment, leaving behind a brittle, crystalline cold. Sound carried strangely in it. The creak of the cabin beams at night. The groan of ice shifting on the creek far below. Even the horse's breathing seemed amplified in the stillness. That morning, Jonah noticed something new. It wasn't Sierra's stance, relaxed, head lowered, or Ash's brighter eyes. It was the snow itself. A series of depressions led from the far tree line to the fence, not the neat paired ovals of deer or the haphazard hop marks of a hare. These were larger, flatter, the tread pattern faint but unmistakable in the powder's crust. Human. Jonah's stomach tightened. He followed the line with his eyes. It came right up to the paddock, stopped at the fence, then retreated the same way. Whoever it was hadn't climbed over, but they'd come close enough to see everything inside. Years in uniform had burned certain responses into him. He crouched to study the prints, noting the depth, about 180, maybe 190 pounds, and the stride length. No dragging feet. Whoever it was, they moved with intent. Jonah glanced back at the cabin, its weathered pine siding blending with the snow-draped world around it. His nearest neighbor was 15 miles down the road. Out here, unexpected company was never casual. He returned to the paddock and ran a calming hand along Ash's neck. "You didn't call for anybody, did you?" he murmured. Sierra's ears flicked back at the sound of his voice, then forward again toward the ridge. Jonah followed her gaze. Nothing moved there. But the hair at the base of his skull prickled. He pulled his gloves tight and stepped into the trees, following the trail. Snow squeaked under his boots, the kind of cold snap sound that always made him feel exposed. The tracks wove between spruce and lodgepole pine, crossing a shallow gully where a fallen log lay half-buried. Jonah moved with the same deliberate pace he'd used clearing alleyways overseas, steady, silent, senses wide. Half a mile in, he saw movement. A figure knelt by the edge of a drift, pulling something from a backpack. For a moment, the old reflex wanted to flatten him against the nearest tree, but the shape resolved into a slender woman in a heavy parka, her hood trimmed with frost. She turned, and the wind carried her voice just far enough. "Don't shoot, I'm friendly." Jonah kept his hands visible but didn't close the distance too quickly. "You're a long way from anywhere," he called. She stood, brushing snow from her knees. "Dr. Leah Reyes, wildlife veterinarian. I've been tracking a small band of Mustangs, chestnut mare, yearling colt, separated from their herd in the last storm. Sound familiar?" Jonah's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer right away. "I was worried they wouldn't make it," she continued. "I picked up their trail a couple days back, but the snow buried it until this morning." She looked past him, toward the clearing. "They're in your paddock, aren't they?" Jonah didn't confirm it, but his silence was its own answer. Leah's eyes softened. "I'm glad they found you, but they won't survive the rest of winter alone. They need to rejoin the herd. Safety in numbers, shared resources. The stallion will accept them back, if we can get them there." Jonah crossed his arms against the cold, or maybe against the memory her words stirred. The idea of sending them back into the wild made sense, but it pressed against something that had been building inside him these past days. "The herd's not exactly next door," he said. "No," Leah admitted, "and the roads are blocked. Trucks can't get in for weeks, maybe longer. But if we can reach the western ridge on foot or with a sled, I have a team waiting. They're camped out near the herd's range." The wind shifted, rattling branches overhead. Jonah scanned the tree line again, habit more than suspicion. "You camped out here alone?" She smiled faintly. "I've handled worse, but I wasn't expecting to find them alive. They must have had help." Jonah didn't answer that either. He just said, "Let's get back to the paddock. We'll talk there." As they walked, Leah kept her steps in his boot prints. "You know," she said, "Sierra's a fighter. But that colt, he wouldn't have lasted another 2 days with that leg. You did good." Jonah didn't look at her, but his grip on the fence rail tightened when they reached the clearing. Sierra's head shot up at the sight of a stranger, ears pinned, body angling protectively over ash. Leah stopped well short, hands out to show she had nothing hidden. "She remembers me," Leah said softly. "I saw them once before the storm. She wouldn't come near, but she watched me for hours." Jonah studied the horses, then the tracks that still scarred the snow beyond the fence. Whoever else came this close in the future might not be a vet with good intentions. The thought was enough to set his mind turning. The problem wasn't whether Sierra and Ash needed to be with their herd. It was how to get them there without losing them to the mountain first. And that, Jonah realized, was a problem he might already be deciding to solve. Jonah stood at the paddock fence, the cold seeping through his gloves as he watched Sierra keep her body between Ash and the stranger. Dr. Leah Reyes didn't move any closer, her breath showing in even puffs, her eyes never leaving the mare's. You said your team's on the western ridge, Jonah said, his voice low, carrying just enough over the quiet. They're set up in a sheltered canyon a few miles from the herd's winter range, Leia replied. They've got portable corrals, feed, and medical supplies. Once Sierra and Ash are there, we can keep them safe until the herd passes close enough for release. Jonah glanced at the snow-choked road beyond his cabin. By truck, that's impossible. By truck, yes, she admitted. And on foot, it's too far for Ash with that leg. But we can't wait weeks. Weather like this doesn't give you weeks. He shifted his weight, eyes narrowing as the solution started forming. Old Charlie, Leia frowned. Old who? My snowmobile, Jonah said. Used it on supply runs years back, cross-country through mountain passes the plows couldn't touch. She's loud, ugly, and stubborn, but she'll climb a wall of ice if you feed her enough gas. I've got an old freight sled in the shed we can reinforce. Haul them both behind me. Leia shook her head. Jonah, they're wild Mustangs. You think they'll just stand on a sled behind a roaring engine? They'll panic, jump, thrash, injure themselves worse. Jonah leaned on the rail, looking at Sierra. Not if she trusts me enough to lead her. She's been following my voice for days now. You saw how she guarded Ash. She makes calculated decisions. If I can get her to step onto the sled calmly, Ash will follow. The vet hesitated, her breath hanging in the still air. It's risky. If she bolts mid-run, both of them could be lost. He met her eyes, steady and unblinking. Every plan out here's risky, but it's better than waiting for them to freeze or starve. Something in his tone, the clipped edges of military certainty, seemed to sway her. She exhaled slowly. All right, but we do this right. We need padded boards on the sled floor, secure side rails, and a harness system that won't choke if they pull back. Jonah gave a small nod. We'll rig it tonight. They spent the next hour hauling supplies from his shed, lengths of plywood, old horse harnesses, coiled rope, and a roll of canvas Jonah had used for makeshift shelters. Leia worked with a quiet competence, measuring and cutting boards, while Jonah reinforced the sled's runners. The metallic clink of nails, the low murmur of their voices, and the occasional thud of falling snow from the pines filled the evening. When the base was solid, Jonah cut strips from an old army blanket to pad the sled floor. Less noise under their hooves, more grip, he explained. Leia fastened the rails with rope lash knots that looked practiced, her fingers quick despite the cold. By lantern light, Jonah approached the paddock. Sierra's head rose immediately, ears forward. He stepped inside, speaking in that same low rhythm he'd used since the first night. The mare's muscles eased as he came closer. He stopped a few feet away, resting his hand lightly on the rail of the sled they'd pulled inside the paddock for her to inspect. The scent of fresh-cut wood and old canvas drifted between them. Sierra's nostrils flared. Jonah took a half-step forward, extending his hand until it hovered near her muzzle. She sniffed it, then flicked her ears back toward Ash. Jonah moved toward the yearling, checking his bandage, then back to Sierra. His hand found the warm line of her neck, fingers brushing the frost from her coat. Her breathing was steady. "This'll take us where you need to go," he said quietly, almost like he was explaining the plan to her as much as to himself. For a moment, the cabin light caught in her dark eyes, and Jonah thought he saw something that wasn't fear. It wasn't trust, not fully, but it was the space where trust might live. Leia stood just outside the paddock, watching. "If she gets on that sled without a fight," she said, "I'll believe anything you tell me." Jonah didn't answer. He just kept his hand on Sierra's neck, feeling the quiet thud of her heartbeat under his palm. An unspoken pact was forming here, one forged in snow and cold, and the unyielding need to survive. They worked until the cold deepened into night, every board and rope double-checked. Jonah stored the sled inside the shed, out of the wind, then walked with Laya back toward the cabin. "You're sure about this?" she asked. "I've been sure since I opened that gate," Jonah said. The air was sharp enough to sting his lungs, but for the first time since the storm began, he felt something warm settling in his chest. Not relief, not yet, but the quiet conviction that the only way forward was through. Tomorrow, the mountain would test them, and he intended to be ready. The cold before dawn had a different bite, sharper, more deliberate, as if the mountain wanted to remind anyone foolish enough to travel that it was in charge. Jonah stepped out of the cabin, breath fogging in quick bursts, his boots crunching over snow that had frozen into a crust overnight. The sled sat by the paddock gate, rails wrapped in rope for grip, the floor padded with canvas and blanket strips. Old Charlie, his battered snowmobile, idled low nearby, exhaust curling into the pale air. Sierra was already alert, her ears flicking between Jonah and the machine. Ash stood close to her shoulder, his bandaged leg planted carefully. Jonah moved into the paddock, speaking in that low, steady tone he'd been using for days. "Morning, girl. We're gonna take a ride." He let Sierra sniff the harness first, rubbing it against his sleeve so it carried his scent. She snorted once but didn't shy away. Jonah eased it over her neck, adjusting the straps with slow precision. Leia waited by the sled, checking the ropes again, her gloved fingers testing each knot. When Sierra was harnessed, Jonah backed her toward the sled. She planted her hooves for a moment, head high, but his voice stayed calm, each word spaced like steady steps. "Easy, easy now." Her weight shifted forward, then back, and finally she stepped onto the padded floor. Ash followed without hesitation, eyes darting toward Jonah as if for confirmation that this was the right move. Leia locked the harness lines to the sled's anchor points. "If they spook, we stop immediately," she said firmly. Jonah nodded, climbed onto the snowmobile, and squeezed the throttle just enough to pull them forward. The sled's runners hissed softly over the crusted snow. Sierra's ears twitched back at the sound of the engine, but her body stayed straight, the line between her and Jonah unbroken. The first mile was smooth, open ground where the storm had scoured the snow into hard waves. Beyond that, the trail narrowed into a winding cut between stands of black spruce. Here the real work began. Hidden rocks lay under the drifts, waiting to jar the sled. Dips in the path could roll a runner if Jonah didn't angle them just right. "Left drift," Leia called from behind, crouched on the sled's back rail. Jonah eased the snowmobile left, keeping his speed steady. The engine's hum echoed off frozen cliffs, bouncing back at them like distant thunder. Halfway through the canyon, a sudden gust barreled down from the ridge. The wind hit like a shove, carrying a blast of snow that blurred the trail into a white smear. Sierra's head shot up, muscles locking. She reared halfway, forelegs slicing the air. Jonah killed the throttle instantly, swung a leg over, and stepped between the sled and her shoulder. His gloved hand brushed her muzzle, his voice a quiet thread against the roar of wind. "You're fine, girl. Right here. Easy." Her breathing was fast, her ears swiveling at every echo, but the tension bled out slowly under his hand. Behind her, Leia checked Ash's bandage, tightening the wrap where the wind had loosened it. "Still stable," she called over the gusts. They pressed on. the trail climbing toward a narrow pass. Snow drifted deep here, swallowing half the sled's height. Jonah leaned his weight, rocking old Charlie side to side until the treads bit through to firmer ground. Twice they had to stop and shovel out the runners, Sierra standing patient now while Laia cleared the front edges. By midday, the sun was a pale coin smudged behind high clouds, throwing no warmth. Their breaths smoked in the air, mingling with the low growl of the engine. Jonah kept his eyes moving. On the trail ahead, the slope above, the shadowed cuts where avalanches liked to start. A ridge wind began to whistle, a high, keening note that made Sierra's ears pin back. Jonah spoke to her again, not because he thought she needed the words, but because the sound of his voice seemed to anchor both of them. Almost there, just a little more. The final stretch of the pass was the worst, a narrow ledge of packed snow clinging to the mountain's side, drop-off yawning to the left. Jonah throttled down, steering wide arcs to keep the sled runners aligned. Laia crouched low, one hand on Sierra's lead line, her gaze fixed ahead. When they finally cleared the ledge and dropped into the next basin, the terrain opened wide. Wind had swept the snow clean here, revealing a frozen creek winding between low hills. Jonah eased to a stop, letting the engine idle while Sierra and Ash drank from a hole in the ice Laia had chipped open. "You weren't kidding," Laia said, brushing frost from her eyelashes. "This trail's a labyrinth." Jonah gave a short nod. "And we're only halfway." The wind shifted again, carrying the faint scent of pine smoke from somewhere down the valley. Jonah's eyes narrowed. If that was Laia's team, they were closer than he thought. But so was whatever else might be out here. He kicked snow over the exhaust to muffle it, then looked back at Sierra. She met his gaze, ears forward now, her breath rising in slow, even streams. The line between them, fragile as frost on a branch, had held through the worst of the maze, and the mountain, for the moment, was letting them pass. They'd been moving for hours when the light began to change. It wasn't gradual, the way dusk usually folds in. It was abrupt, a gray curtain dropping over the basin, swallowing the hills on either side. Jonah looked up to see the ridge vanish in a churn of white. "Storm," he muttered, voice flat. He didn't need to say more. Leia's head snapped toward the north, where the wind was already carrying thin streamers of snow down into the valley. It hit faster than either of them expected. One moment, the air was sharp and still. The next, wind clawed at their faces, dragging sheets of snow sideways hard enough to sting through fabric. Visibility shrank to a few yards. The trail ahead dissolved into a formless white wall. Jonah throttled down and swung old Charlie in a wide arc, scanning the landscape for cover. The basin was too exposed. Any minute the wind would bury the path entirely. "There!" Laia pointed to a dark smudge at the base of a low bluff. They pushed toward it, the snowmobile growling under the strain. The sled rocked as Sierra shifted her weight against the wind. Ash pressed tight to her side. Jonah's shoulders were tight against the handlebars. The muscles in his forearms locked. When they reached the bluff, the smudge resolved into a shallow cave, its mouth half sheltered by a drift. Jonah cut the engine, and the sudden silence rang in his ears. He was already moving, unhooking Sierra from the sled, leading her and Ash inside where the rock face blocked the worst of the wind. The air inside was frigid, but still. Snow swirled at the entrance, dying in soft heaps just past the threshold. Jonah dropped his pack and began clearing space. He built a small ring of stones, scraped from under the drift at the cave wall, and pulled out a bundle of kindling wrapped in waxed cloth. Laia knelt beside Ash, checking the bandage with quick, efficient hands. The first match flared. a tiny flame fighting the draft, and then caught. In minutes, a steady fire licked at the wood, sending light and heat into the hollow. Steam began to rise from Sierra's coat as she stood just close enough to warm without crowding the flames. Jonah held his hands over the fire, feeling the prickling thaw in his fingers. Leia draped her scarf around Ash's legs, gently drying the snowmelt from his coat. "Swelling's holding steady," she said, glancing up. "Your wrap's doing its job." Jonah nodded but didn't answer. He was watching Sierra. The flicker of firelight danced in her dark eyes, catching the fine frost along her lashes. She wasn't just tolerating his presence. She was looking at him, her ears relaxed, her breathing slow. "Feels like the first right thing I've done in a long time," Jonah said quietly, almost to himself. Leia looked at him over the flames. "You've been doing the right thing since the night you opened that gate." He didn't respond right away. The fire popped, a small ember arcing up before settling back. "I've spent years keeping people out. Told myself it was better that way. No attachments, no losses. But I see them, how they look after each other. And I realize maybe I've just been hiding from what matters." The wind moaned outside, filling the pause. Leia's expression softened, but she didn't press. She just fed another stick to the fire and let the warmth push back at the cold. Sierra shifted closer, her shadow stretching long on the cave wall. Ash gave a quiet nicker, the sound low and content. Jonah found himself leaning forward, resting his forearms on his knees, the heat on his face and the cold at his back making a strange balance he hadn't felt in years. Time stretched in that space. Just firelight, breath, and the steady sound of the wind outside. Jonah caught himself thinking about the trail ahead, not with dread, but with a kind of quiet determination. They'd make it. He'd see to that. When the worst of the storm had passed, hours later, though it felt shorter, Jonah stepped outside. The world was changed again. Drifts sculpted into new shapes, the trail erased, the air clear and sharp. Stars blinked through gaps in the clouds, cold and bright. He turned back toward the cave. Sierra was standing just inside the entrance, ears forward, her silhouette framed in the fire's glow. Ash dozed against her side. Jonah met her gaze and felt something settle, a wordless agreement forged in snow and shelter. Tomorrow they'd push on. But tonight, the fire held, the cave walls kept the wind at bay, and for the first time in a long while, Jonah felt less like a man cut off from the world, and more like someone finding his way back to it. "If you'd like, I can move directly into Fan 8, the farewell, where they reach Leia's team, and Jonah must let Sierra and Ash go. This will keep the emotional arc flowing without losing the thread of the journey." Morning broke clean and cold, the kind of winter clarity that made every edge sharp, the bluff's shadow long across the basin, the frost on the cave walls sparkling like powdered glass. Jonah had the fire down to embers, kicking snow over the last of it, while Leia packed her medical kit. Outside, Sierra and Ash waited near the sled, their breath streaming in soft white clouds. The storm had scoured the valley, but the air was still, the trail ahead marked only by the faint roll of the land. Jonah gave old Charlie a few slow pulls until the engine growled to life. The sound rolled across the snow and bounced back from the far ridge. Sierra flicked an ear at it, but her body stayed loose. Ash shifted his weight, his bandaged leg planted carefully, but without the wince Jonah had seen before. They moved out at a steady pace. The snowmobile's treads bit into the hard crust, the sled gliding smooth behind it. Hills folded away as they traveled, each ridge revealing another sweep of open white. Leia kept scanning ahead, leaning to point out a cut between two rises. By midday, they dropped into a shallow creek bed, the snow here packed by wind into a smooth, low corridor. The air carried a faint, dry scent, wood smoke thin but growing stronger. Jonah throttled back, scanning the bend ahead. They rounded it to find a line of trucks half buried in snow, a portable corral set up beside a cluster of canvas tents. People moved between them, bundled in heavy coats, their voices carrying in short bursts over the cold. One man waved from the corral gate, his gloved hand slicing through the clear air. "That's my crew," Leia said, relief cutting into her tone. Jonah eased old Charlie to a stop. Sierra's head came up, ears swiveling at the sight of other humans and horses inside the corral. Ash stayed close to her flank, his eyes wide. Leia swung down first, speaking low to Sierra as she unhooked the harness. The mare stepped forward with that same measured caution Jonah had come to know, assessing, weighing, deciding. The corral gate stood open, the scent of hay and other Mustangs rolling out on the breeze. Jonah moved to her head, his hand resting lightly along the warm line of her cheek. Her dark eyes found his, and for a long breath, neither of them moved. Then she leaned, just enough for him to feel the weight of her muzzle against his coat. He let his forehead rest against hers, the world narrowing to the sound of her breath. No words came. There weren't any that fit. The snow muffled everything except the quiet beat of a connection that had begun in a storm and somehow held through all the miles since. Ash hesitated at the base of the ramp, glancing back at Jonah. It was quick, just a flick of his gaze, but it stayed with Jonah as the colt stepped up after his mother and into the corral. Leia stood by the gate, giving Jonah space. "They'll get a full checkup, and when the herd passes close enough, we'll release them together." He nodded once, eyes still on Sierra as she turned inside the corral. The other Mustangs shifted to make room, sniffing the air, the way wild things greet their own. Sierra held her ground, then lowered her head to the hay. Ash mirrored her movements almost perfectly. The gate shut with a clean metallic click. Jonah stepped back, his boots sinking into the snow. The truck's engines rumbled faintly in the background, but all he could hear was the wind moving across the open ground, softer now, as if the mountain had accepted the exchange. He took a slow breath, the cold biting deep, and let it out. Leia came to stand beside him. "Most people wouldn't have taken them in," she said quietly. "Most people don't live with an empty paddock," Jonah replied. They walked back toward old Charlie, the tracks they'd made already beginning to fill. Jonah didn't look back right away, but when he did, Sierra was standing at the corral's far side, her gaze fixed on him through the rails. It wasn't a plea or a question, just a steady look that landed heavy in his chest. Then the wind shifted, and she turned toward Ash, nudging him toward the hay. Jonah let the image fix itself in his mind, the mare, the colt, the quiet assurance that they were where they needed to be. When the engine growled under his hands again, it felt louder than it had on the trail. The stillness they left behind wasn't empty, though. It was full of hoofprints, of breath, of something unspoken that would follow him back to the cabin. He pointed old Charlie toward the open valley, the sled light behind him now. The mountain loomed ahead, sharp and endless, but the weight in his chest had shifted. Not gone, never gone, but carrying something different. Tomorrow would be just him again. But tonight, in the quiet of his cabin, he'd hear the echo of hoofbeats in the snow and know they were still out there, running toward the rest of their story. The weeks that followed slipped into a rhythm Jonah hadn't known he was capable of keeping again. The cabin felt both emptier and somehow fuller. The paddock stood silent under its crust of snow. Yet every time he passed it, he caught himself glancing toward the gate, half expecting the shape of a chestnut mare to be standing there. One morning, as March sunlight cut sharper across the snowfields, the sound of the snowmobile's engine didn't come from his own shed. It came from the ridge road, a low hum that grew until a figure crested the slope. Leia dismounted, her parka frosted at the seams, a wide grin tugging against the cold. "I thought you'd want these," she said, pulling a weathered envelope from her pack. Inside were photographs. Sierra, her coat shining under the pale green haze of early spring grass. Ash beside her with his blaze brighter and his stance solid. His injured leg was straight and strong. "They've been thriving," Leia said. "The herd came through last week. We've got a release planned for tomorrow. I wanted to invite you to see it." Jonah studied the pictures again. The mountains behind them were bare in patches now, streaks of rock showing through snow. Ash's ears were forward, his eyes bright, no hesitation in the set of his body. "I'll be there," Jonah said simply. The next morning, the sun was already climbing by the time Jonah reached the western ridge. The wind was up, but it carried the sense of thaw, damp soil somewhere under the snow, the faint tang of pine sap. Leia's team was waiting at a broad, fenced paddock that opened onto a sweep of rolling hills. Sierra and Ash stood near the gate, their breath white in the cool air. Other Mustangs milled beyond them, the rest of the herd grazing at the edge of sight. A black stallion raised his head once, watching. Jonah walked to the rail and stood there, hands hooked over the weathered wood. Sierra's ears turned toward him. She didn't move right away, but her eyes found his, and for a moment, it was just the two of them again in the middle of a snowstorm, the rest of the world held at bay. Leia gave the signal. The gate swung open with a metallic creak that seemed loud in the open air. Sierra's head came up, nostrils flaring toward the hills. Ash sidestepped once, glancing between her and Jonah. Then Sierra took a step forward, slow at first, and the colt followed. Halfway to the hills, the black stallion broke into a trot, meeting them with a toss of his mane. Sierra didn't flinch. She closed the distance, Ash shadowing her stride, and the stallion wheeled in a smooth arc, leading them toward the open ground. And then they were running. It was a different kind of movement than the careful pacing of the sled or the guarded steps in Jonah's paddock. This was all muscle and wind, hooves drumming the thawing earth in a rhythm older than fences. The herd folded around them, the sound of their gallop rising until it filled the valley. Jonah stood still, watching until the chestnut and the blaze blurred into the larger shape of the herd. They crested a low hill, sunlight catching Sierra's coat, and then dropped into the next draw, the sound of them fading to a distant, rolling thunder. Leia stepped up beside him. "You did more than just get them here," she said. "You gave them back their life." He didn't answer right away. His eyes were still on the place where they'd vanished, the snow already drifting faintly across their hoof prints. "It works both ways," Jonah said finally. "Sometimes you give something back, and it gives you back too." They stood there a while longer, letting the wind carry the last echoes of the herd's run. The sun climbed higher, scattering light across the ridge, and for the first time in years, Jonah felt that light reach places in him he thought had been sealed off for good. When he turned toward the snowmobile, the trail home didn't feel like a retreat. It felt like the next leg of a journey he hadn't realized he'd started, one that had nothing to do with the miles between valleys, and everything to do with the ground he'd covered inside. Behind him, the hills held their silence, and somewhere beyond them, Sierra and ash were part of the wind again. Snowmelt was running in thin silver threads down the slope behind Jonah's cabin, tracing lines through the hard crust toward the creek. The air had changed, not warm yet, but different, touched with the damp weight of spring's approach. The paddock stood empty, its rails weathered, the ground inside pocked with the faint depressions of old hoofprints. He'd left them there, refusing to let wind and time erase them too quickly. Jonah sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the tree line where the ridge broke open into sky. In the weeks since the release, he'd replayed it more times than he cared to admit. Sierra's steady walk through the open gate, Ash's brief glance back, the way the herd had swallowed them whole and carried them into the hills. He thought about the man he'd been before the storm, a man content to live behind walls, keeping his own company because it was easier than risking another loss. A man who'd convinced himself that shutting the door was the same thing as surviving. The truth had come slow, like thawing ice. First in the sound of hoofbeats outside his window, then in the weight of Sierra's breath against his palm. Then, in the moment, Ash stood still while Jonah's hands worked the bandage loose. Those small shifts had built something he couldn't see until it was too solid to ignore. He lifted the mug, felt the warmth seep into his hands. "The walls we build to protect ourselves," he said aloud, voice low in the morning quiet, "can also keep out the light." The steam curled into the air, disappearing almost as quickly as the words. He thought about how close he'd come to ignoring that first faint whimper in the storm. How easy it would have been to tell himself it was nothing. To stay by the fire and let the wild take its course. And how, if he had, 2 Mustangs would be gone now, and something inside him would have stayed buried just as deep. It wasn't just about saving them. That was the surface story, the visible trail in the snow. Beneath it was another map entirely. The way helping them had forced him to step outside the bunker he'd made of his own life, to risk connection when every instinct said it was safer not to. He leaned back in the chair, letting the sun edge over the porch rail and onto his face. Out here in this quiet, it was easy to believe that the line between human and animal wasn't as wide as people thought. Both could be wounded. Both could learn to trust again. Jonah set the mug down and picked up the small spiral pad from the table, the one he'd used to track Ash's recovery. The last entry, dated weeks ago, read, "Swelling gone. Movement strong. Sierra leading. Ash keeping up." He turned the page and started writing something new. Not a note for himself this time, but for anyone who might come across it. If you see a creature or a person in need, don't turn away. You don't have to have the perfect tools or the perfect timing. Sometimes all that matters is that you show up and you stay. You might think you're saving them, but in the end, you might just be saving yourself too. He tore the page free, pinned it under a smooth stone on the porch rail. The wind tugged at the edges, but it held. Inside the cabin, the radio crackled faintly, catching fragments of voices from the valley. Jonah listened for a moment, then turned the dial down until it was just a murmur. The real sound he wanted was outside, the creak of trees in the breeze, the rush of the creek below, the faint echo of hoofbeats his memory refused to let fade. He looked toward the ridge again, half smiling. "Run far," he murmured, picturing Sierra and Ash against the endless sky. "Run strong." The sun lifted higher, scattering light across the snowmelt, and Jonah let it wash over him. The season was turning, the mountains shifting into their next chapter, and for the first time in years, he felt ready to turn with them. "If you're hearing this," he imagined saying into a camera, into a microphone, or maybe just to whoever needed it most, "tell me your story. Tell me about the moment an animal changed you, or the day you realized you couldn't walk away. Share it. Someone else might need to hear it. Someone else might be waiting for their own gate to open." The words hung in the air like breath in the cold, and then, slowly, they disappeared into the morning. But the meaning stayed. Somewhere out there, a chestnut mare and her yearling were part of the wind again. And here, on this porch in the Montana high country, a man who thought he was done with connections knew better now, and was ready to keep the door open.